I'm always glad to see polite people like you. God be with you.
Greetings.
Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is hands down my favorite Western RPG of 2025. In fact, it's probably my favorite Western RPG since the original release back in 2018. The melee combat is the best I've ever seen in a first-person game. The freedom to explore and interact with the world around you far outstrip anything done by the old RPG juggernauts of yesteryear, and the rounded world design feels like a refreshing change of pace. It's great not to be the chosen one, to know the fate of the entire world doesn't rest in my hands for once, that the NPCs don't bend over backwards to make me feel powerful or smart, and finally, the fact that the only man capable of resurrection spells has ascended to the heavens over 1,000 years ago makes each death actually feel impactful, instead of just making me wonder why this convenient little resurrections role doesn't seem to work for anyone except me and my party members. The plot is filled with larger-than-life, charismatic characters. The dialogue writers know when to be funny and when to take things seriously. The motion capture looks great, and the way Henry fits into the story, not as an important mover and shaker, but rather an obstinate bastard who happens to be the right person for the job, feels novel and interesting, full of truly unexpected twists and turns. In short, I love almost everything about this game. Yes, almost everything. While ACD2 is great, it's also far from perfect. I'll elaborate further when we get to the story part of the review, but to put it simply, this game feels like two chefs fighting over a very expensive kitchen. Warhorse Studios was originally formed from ex-Mafia and Operation Flashpoint developers, and to me at least, the differences in design philosophy from this dual heritage appear to clash much more often than they did in the first game. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First off, I wanna talk about my experiences with Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 as a PC game, which brings us to the technical aspect. Anyone who's played the original Kingdom Come knows it suffered from significant performance issues around densely populated areas. The Rattay surroundings were notoriously heavy on CPUs of the time, so when Warhorse Studios announced ACD2 would feature a large city, I couldn't help but worry about even larger performance problems. Thankfully, they somehow did it. Despite the improved graphics, the sequel runs buttery smooth even in the city of Utenberg, which has about 10 times the population of Rattay. Other technical improvements worth noting are the UI, which received a full overhaul and now looks a lot more attractive, especially in an ultra-wide monitor, the addition of upscaling and HDR support, and finally, the ability to turn off that annoying yellow dot at the center of the screen. Also, ACD2 features fully rebindable controls, allowing you to assign up to 2 E's for each command, plus the option to change your FOV. That was also the case with the first game, but I think those are important enough features to highlight either way. I did run into some issues though. For instance, the game limits itself to 30 FPS when running in the background, and I couldn't find any way to change that behavior, which really annoyed me as I frequently alt-tabbed to do stuff on my second monitor while listening to the dialogue. I also had a much less annoying but significantly weirder issue where every time I launched the game, any media I had playing in the background like a stream, YouTube video, Spotify, whatever, would just die and require me to refresh the page. It happens literally every single time. It only happens with this game, and I tried every fix I could think of short of contacting my local parish for an exorcism, but nothing worked. Other than that, I had the occasional glitch like Mutt teleporting inside areas he shouldn't be able to enter, NPCs slipping into each other, you know, this sort of open world RPG junk we've been seeing ever since open world games became a thing. Pop-ins were also very prevalent during the prologue, but decreased in frequency as I played, and as a very welcome surprise, I didn't have a single crash in over 200 hours of playing. Combat in the Kingdom Come series figure among one of its more unique and interesting aspects. Melee combat at its core feels similar to the mechanics featured in the Mount & Blade series, where moving your mouse allows you to select attack directions, but much deeper and with a greater focus on authenticity. Grounded in real-life historical European martial arts, or HEMA for short, fights have a methodical yet frantic feel to them, often switching between fast-paced swordplay followed by some tense repositioning as both you and your enemies try to recover some stamina. Once you draw your weapon, the Emerald will immediately lock to the nearest enemy in range, marked by the combat rosette, which is really more like a star. Through this rosette, you're able to select your angle of attack as well as receive visual feedback about the best moment to parry or counter enemy strikes. Attacking isn't just a matter of swinging your weapon though. Sword fighting requires you to put your entire body's weight into every move, from your arms and shoulders all the way down to your feet, and Warhorse Studios put a crazy amount of effort into depicting that process. So, clicking the attack button doesn't just play a quick animation of your blade moving across the screen disconnected from everything else. Instead, it sets off a whole chain of events where Henry steps forward, shifting all his weight to his front foot and strikes with purpose. The enemy reactions to getting hit look really good too, making each attack feel weighty and impactful. Henry's stats and skills level up throughout the game as you would expect, but ACD's focus on authenticity means those improvements are a lot less pronounced than in other RPGs. Even a fully leveled up Henry using the best armor in the game ended up dead in a ditch after blindly charging a bandit camp. The developers are clear in their messaging. This is not a power fantasy. Fights are dangerous and you will die if you're not careful. Since Henry's health doesn't actually increase as he levels, the main way of improving your survivability is by equipping armor, and the armor system in ACD2 does a great job at making you feel like an actual knight. Weaker hits will bounce off of your steel shell, leaving the squishy human inside nice and unharmed, while hits that manage to penetrate will hurt like hell and potentially leave you bleeding. The game uses a highly detailed hitbox system that tracks the exact location where a hit lands and calculates damage accordingly, creating an interesting dynamic as even the best helmet in the world won't be very useful against a hit to the face unless you have its visor down, for example. This system is so detailed, in fact, I once saw a bandit's life being saved because he moved his head slightly to the left, just in time for his helmet to deflect a crossbow bolt that would have hit him in the face otherwise. Of course, the blow still stunned him and allowed me to finish him off with my sword, but it helps show just how precise the damage modeling in ACD2 is. Suffice to say that I absolutely love it, and in terms of first-person melee combat, I believe it's the best on the market. There are also, of course, ranged weapons, bows, crossbows, and period-accurate firearms, which is to say, literal hand cannons. While not as deep as the melee system, ranged combat feels very satisfying. There are no crosshairs to guide you, and bringing a gun to a sword fight isn't quite the same trump card as it is in modern times, but use it wisely, they can be very handy in thinning out enemy groups before they notice you. You also have access to Mutt, Henry's hunting dog, who's not only an amazing hunting partner but also very useful during battles as he runs around, distracting and biting your enemies. He's somewhat fragile and very high maintenance, requiring constant petting and food, but as Henry's only steadfast companion, he can really help even the odds when fighting multiple enemies. The combat system does have some flaws, and rather frustrating ones at that. The targeting system struggles when facing multiple enemies, which are the majority of fights in the game, and learning how to move your mouse just enough to change your attack direction without accidentally changing targets takes a decent bit of practice. In the same vein, Your attacks don't work very well when there's too much of a difference in elevation between you and your target, for example, in a staircase. That can be easily dealt with by moving to a different position though, so it's not that big of a deal. There's also a hardcore difficulty that was added later via a patch, much like in the first game. Hardcore Henry is forced to be at least 3 out of 10 negative pairs and loses access to a lot of the in-game quality of life features, like the health and stamina bars, Ompas, and fast travel. Speaking of quality of life features, there's one I wanna highlight. Sometimes the game takes away your equipment or changes it into something else for story reasons. Whenever these story sequences are over, a pop-up asks you if you wanna re-equip whatever you had before. It's a very convenient little feature that I wish became standard in these sorts of games. There's a broad variety of activities you can take part in. Hunting, alchemy, dice rolling, thieving, haggling, fist fighting, archery contests, melee tournaments, and horse racing all make a return from the first game with slight improvements. Smithing is the big addition, allowing the player to forge weapons for himself and others, and with the Legacy of the Forge DLC, you can even pump your own blacksmithing workshop to take on customers' orders and participate in guild activities. Another addition is the horse archery contest, which is self-explanatory. Hit as many targets as you can while riding a horse around a circuit, which is very useful to train your shooting skills, both in terms of Henry's stats and your own real-life mouse aiming. Overall, these systems aren't particularly deep, but they add so much appreciated variety. Sneaking works pretty much the same as the first game. Heavier armor makes more noise than clothing, crouching in the dark and wearing darker clothes makes you harder to spot. There's a conspicuousness stat that affects how likely you are to stand out in a crowd, and even your smell can give your position away, especially when trying to sneak upon animals. You can drop items and make noise to attract someone's attention, and new to ACD2 is a stone throwing mechanic that you can use to lure people to certain spots. Using the best stealth gear in the game with a maxed out sneaking skill does feel a bit like easy mode though, as it becomes so hard to detect, NPCs will walk right past and still fail to notice you. Lastly, your social status is very important. Henry isn't a nobleman, but others don't need to know that, so if you have a good reputation and dress well, people will recognize that and be more likely to trust you and treat you with respect, while if you dress poorly and people know you've been committing crimes in the area, they'll show you suspicion and contempt, especially the guards who may even stop you and randomly demand to search your pockets for stolen property. Dirt and blood are also taken into account, so you have to occasionally take a bath and wash your clothes. Hunger and sleep are also a factor, heavily affecting your attributes when neglected, and your equipment will get damaged and wear out through general use, to the point even walking around will damage your shoes. A lot of people tend to get turned off by this sort of maintenance-heavy gameplay, but in ACD2 at least, they didn't really get in the way of my fun. Your needs don't drain very quickly for starters, and the items and sleeping spots you need to recover them are everywhere. You'll be fine as long as you hunt a rabbit every couple of days, sleep a few hours whenever you are in town, and repair your equipment when the low durability warning shows up. More controversial is the somewhat restrictive saving system. You can only save by sleeping in your bed, reaching mission checkpoints, leaving the game, or drinking saver snaps, which is the closest the game has to a quick save. I know this can sound frustrating for people used to more traditional open world RPGs, and to be honest, I actually used the unlimited saving mod back in the first game, but this time I decided to give it a shot, and I found the lack of an easy save function actually forced me to play more strategically, especially when sneaking around some poor bastard's house. Plus, saver snaps are really easy to obtain. Every tavern will always have a few bottles for sale, and they're one of the easiest and cheapest potions to brew. In fact, good quality saver snaps actually gives you a temporary stat buff, so you're incentivized to drink some before every fight. To show you how much of a non-issue it is, here's my load screen. By the time I reached the end of the story, I had literally saved 1411 times. That's right, 1411. So if you're on the fence because of the saving system, trust me, it's really not an issue. Or just mod it away if you really have to, I guess. Lastly, I wanna talk about the in-game economy, the weakest part of the game for me, especially in how it undermines the early game story. The prologue involves Henry and his friend/rival Anthapon losing all of their money and equipment and becoming stranded in another large domain. So a lot of the early game revolves around working your way back up the social ladder, earning enough money and reputation to move on to Henry and Hans's actual objective. That's a great idea on paper, but the economy is so broken. You can literally become the richest man in the starting village by gathering herbs from the surrounding fields and turning them into potions. It doesn't even take that long, an hour or two at most. It just made the whole initial sequence feel forced, and if you don't want to grind herbs, well, just go around the nearby forest for a bit until you're attacked by bandits. Murder them, take their stuff, and go sell it at the local pawn shop. Easy money without even needing to break the law. Worse, there are very few reasons to spend money other than buying better equipment, causing you to accumulate Roshan at a rapid pace after you've assembled your loadout. So, by the time I found the best armor in the game, I had literally tens of thousands in my pocket, ready to buy it, and then that was it. Henry just kept carrying this ever-expanding stack of silver everywhere he went, never acknowledging its existence, even as his friends kept complaining about needing piles of money for very important plot reasons. The Kingdom Elm series is a piece of historical fiction. In other words, a fictional story that's based on real locations and events. This means the developer started off with a wealth of real, verifiable records to help build the game world, but it also brings with it a whole slew of expectations a fantasy writer doesn't have to think about. For historical fiction, you also need to ensure it is faithful to the time and place you're trying to depict. I'll be the first to admit any knowledge of 15th century Bohemia I have is 100% due to the original Kingdom Elm Deliverance. It's just not my wheelhouse, so I can't really talk about how good a job they did from a historian's perspective, but I can very easily say that from where I'm sitting, they did an amazing job. For starters, the world is full of dynamic NPCs going about their business, each with their own schedules, families, and homes. Too many RPGs treat NPCs as little more than static objects that you sometimes talk to, and it makes the world feel lifeless and desolate. Walking around town, being greeted by the locals as you pass by, sitting down at the tavern for some roasted pig and a game of dice, then leaving for my next side quest and maybe running into a fellow traveler on the way. It all makes the game world feel less like a game and more like a world, and it can often lead to some unexpected, unique results. For example, there was this one side quest where I was supposed to kill a group of bandits but leave their leader alive. I didn't want to risk getting into a huge fight and accidentally killing the guy I was meant to spare, so before doing anything else, I snuck around their camp and managed to quietly knock him out. Then I proceeded to slowly pick them off one by one. As I was finishing the job though, I heard a bunch of yelling and sword fighting nearby, and when I looked up I saw the leader, who was supposed to be unconscious, dueling some random huntsman. I panicked and attacked the huntsman to stop him from killing the bandit leader. 2 against 1 made short work of the huntsman, but then of course, the leader moved on to trying to murder me. What followed was a tense fight where an unarmed and unarmored Henry tried to beat down a fully armored axeman using just his bare fists and Mutt's help. Now, I don't know exactly what happened there, but I've often met huntsmen walking around these parts, and the bandit camp was right beside the road, so I figured he was just passing by when he spotted a bunch of bandit corpses. Eventually, he noticed the bandit leader was still alive and woke him up. The leader then did as bandits do and attacked the huntsman, who proceeded then to obviously defend himself. Then I showed up and killed him. That wasn't some scripted event planned by a developer who wanted to screw over the player, but rather a chain of events that arose from a random nameless NPC dynamically reacting to a situation created by me. How cool is that?
Why would you let me live?
The way NPCs react to rhyme is a lot more granular and detailed when compared to other series. For starters, people don't like strangers walk into their homes uninvited and will firmly tell you to leave. If you do, they usually check if any of their valuables are missing, and if they are, they'll assume you took them. Guards are not telepaths though, so they need to either witness a crime in progress or have someone physically go and report it to them before rushing over to do something about it. Even then, it takes a while before the entire garrison knows about it, which makes complete sense as there are still a few hundred years left before someone invents the walkie-talkie. The NPC AI also excels in reacting to the player using or trying to sell stolen items. The game tracks the location where each item was stolen from, and people from that region recognize them. Some don't care, but others will call you out on it and even get the guards involved, trying to sell an item back to its owner in particular and lead to some interesting interactions.
Stupid one at that.
All of this to say, the NPC behavior in this game is the deepest, most well-developed I've ever seen in any RPGs. They do suffer a bit from repeated dialogue lines though, and it can get a bit grating after a while, but hey, at least they're not talking about mud crabs.
Annoying creatures.
And don't even get me started on the attention to detail. Everything from the small peasant hut to craftsmen's workshops, to the castles and fortresses look like actual places where people live and work in. The castles in particular are beautiful recreations of real-life fortifications that may as well be virtual museums for all the interesting details Warhorse Studios remember to include, the kind of stuff fantasy games tend to ignore in favor of player convenience. You see, people think of castles as the homes of kings and noblemen, and of course that's correct, but they often forget these castles were above all fortresses, meant to protect the lives of their occupants. The practical implications of this defensive mindset are everywhere in castle design, from their entrances built to act as choke points, to room layout meant to confuse and slow down invaders, to even the stair design, often made narrow on purpose to force invaders to go upstairs one by one while also leaving them exposed to the defenders waiting above. These aren't levels designed to look impressive to the player while allowing easy access to a quest giver and maybe a couple of shops. They're confusing, last-ditch death traps built to stop invading forces, or at least delay them long enough until reinforcements arrive, and Kingdom Come is the only RPG series where I've seen that distinction taken seriously. There are all sorts of hidden nooks and crannies to find, not due to any gameplay or story implications, but rather for the simple fact that they would have been there 600 years ago, and funnily enough, the best example I can point to is the sheer amount of pieces spread around in every settlement. Garderobes, outhouse, chamber pot, and even the humble shit bucket appear everywhere there's human life, as they should. Bigger settlements like Gutenberg are absolutely flooded with every type of human and animal refuse you can find, sometimes shoved into corners, other times right in the middle of crowded streets, and let me be clear, I'm genuinely praising them for that. One of my biggest pet peeves with fantasy games is how often they gloss over just how challenging the issue of public sanitation used to be in the Middle Ages, and how that led directly to the many plagues that swept throughout Europe at the time. I understand that for many people, the appeal of fantasy is precisely in inhabiting an idealized world, and part of that involves avoiding all of the gross, disgusting aspects of real life, but for me, their presence helps round the setting and make the world all the more believable for it. Another consequence of ACD2's grounding in real history, which is often overlooked in fantasy games, is the language barrier. Henry meets all sorts of foreigners, and they often speak in their own language, adding some extra dose of authenticity to the setting, and sometimes leading Henry into hilarious misunderstandings. Latin, as the universal language of noblemen and priests everywhere, is also heavily featured in the game, and I can only imagine the sheer amount of effort the whole team, including the voice actors, must have put toward making it all sound natural and accurate.
Occultatur rocus plenus peccatorum.
Crimina fraudes occisiones ea orbs animam suam quotidie perdit.
There's also a Odes tab in the inventory menu, which provides short but enlightening and occasionally funny write-ups about the customs, places, events, and characters depicted in the game. If you love European history, I highly recommend you give it a look. As great as the game is on that front, and maybe precisely because ACD2's depiction of medieval Bohemia feels so authentic, there are some details missing whose absence I couldn't help but notice. There are no children anywhere, which severely detracts from the illusion, made worse by the game often bringing up the topic in quest dialogue. Medieval Bohemia is full of pregnant women who need Henry's help, and yet there's not a single baby in sight. Likewise, churches, a central aspect of medieval culture and some of the most beautiful, richly decorated buildings in any settlement, are all unfortunately closed off save for one DLC location. Also, though the NPC AI works great, I found myself wishing I would have more meaningful interactions with the generic, nameless NPCs, like hiring a mercenary to act as a follower, help me out in combat, and carry my burdens for a while. Or being able to ask random travelers for directions to the nearest inn, for instance. Just so we are clear, I'm not saying the game is bad for not having these features. As I've said at the start, this is my favorite Western RPG in years, and I understand there are many reasons why the developers might have decided against those additions, but the lack of children running around in particular, in a game that otherwise feels so authentic, causes a certain uncanny valley effect that's prevalent every time I enter a settlement. None of these are deal breakers at all, but they are points that I feel would be improved upon. Moving on to the story, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 starts just a few days after the end of the first game, as Henry, Hans Apon, and a small escort arrive in the Trossy region of Bohemia as messengers carrying a letter to the local lord, an influential nobleman named Otto von Berghoff, hoping to convince him to work with their allies towards putting a stop to the civil war currently ravaging the kingdom. Since this is a massive AAA open-world RPG, this simple delivery job turns out to be a lot more complicated than expected, embroiling them in all sorts of trouble, conspiracies, and danger. I'm of two minds regarding the story of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. On the one hand, the side quests are amazing. Helping the peasants, burghers, and minor nobility of Bohemia presents the player with a wealth of experiences and insight into their way of life. Many of them contain their own share of drama, surprises, and heartfelt moments. Even better, the game gives players a lot of freedom in how to complete their objectives, and accounts for that in their end results, even including achievements for particularly difficult or funny solutions. Not every side quest is a masterpiece, of course, but most of them are well written, entertaining short stories that put Henry in interesting situations. On the other hand, the main plot has issues. Taken in isolation, it's great. If I had watched all of the cutscenes and plot-related dialogue stitched together as a movie, I would have loved it from start to end. The prologue is a bit slow and bogged down by the decision to condense the first game's events into a couple of unskippable slow-walking sequences, but once you leave that initial portion behind, it starts picking up steam and never stops. Both writers and actors did a wonderful job making each character feel human, with their own beliefs, ambitions, emotions, and flaws. Allegiances shift constantly as characters learn new information, people botch flawless ideas and flawlessly execute botched ideas all the time, and the villains are smart, proactive, and empathetic in ways that feel real, instead of going for the lazy "boo-hoo, he's evil because he has a tragic past" explanation. More importantly, the writers managed to avoid so many of the common pitfalls of game writing. I never felt like they were patronizing me or contriving illogical situations that only Henry can solve just because he's the main character. They weren't afraid to let him fade into the background as NPCs take the spotlight when it makes sense, and especially how to make conflict between members of the main cast feel as authentic clashes grounded in their personalities and beliefs rather than made-up drama for drama's sake. They knew how to portray trauma, loss, and the multitude of ways people deal or often fail to deal with them. They gave me choices and consequences not in a binary, superficial manner, but in interesting ways that sometimes led to surprising results, and they never, ever treated Henry as a hero by default. Getting there takes effort, and making the right choices from word go, and it's likely many players won't. Spoiler alert, I didn't. But all of that praise is for the main plot taken in isolation, away from the rest of the game. When you play ACD2, you won't get just the main plot, you get the whole package, and there lies the problem. I often felt as if I was playing two different games at the same time. On the one side, the simulation heavy, player freedom first, realistic sandbox that allowed me to do anything I wanted and did its best to try and react to my actions in ways that made sense, while on the other, a linear yet wonderful cinematic narrative where, similar to The Witcher 3, I was playing a well-defined character and following a preset path with very little freedom to deviate from it, but by following through to its conclusion, I experienced one of the best stories of revenge and political intrigue that I've seen in recent times. Isolated from each other, the game does great in both aspects, but way too often it felt like they were fighting for dominance, leading to jarring results. You see, there are quite a few scenes that assume Henry did or didn't do something, has or doesn't have something, noticed or didn't notice something, and so on, all for the sake of creating the plot development the writers want to happen. In other words, the game ignores the player's actions to serve the needs of the plot. Similarly, there are a bunch of main quests which are ostensibly about dealing with urgent matters, but the game waves that away for the sake of allowing players to run off and explore the world. It's hard to discuss this without getting into spoiler territory, so I'll limit myself to a couple examples. First, a significant part of the plot revolves around Henry and his allies needing money for various reasons, and yet my Henry routinely had tens of thousands of Russian in his pocket and no one even mentions it. Likewise, in a particularly jarring occasion, I had the perfect chance to shoot one of the antagonists in the middle of a battle, so of course I did, but the bolt went right through him because the writers needed him to survive this fight so he would show up later. And let me be clear, I'm not complaining about that antagonist having plot armor, I'm complaining about the game putting me in a position where that antagonist is 5 feet in front of me, I naturally decide to shoot him, the game completely ignores my crossbow bolt going right through his head, and then he flees unharmed in a cutscene, giving me the means, motive, and opportunity to kill a villain, only to pretend nothing happened when I take the shot, is just about the worst thing a game can do. It shatters any and all illusion of player freedom that they've managed to slowly build over dozens and dozens of hours. I know this part sounds very negative, so I just want you to understand all of these complaints do not erase any of the praise I've given ACD2 for most of this review. It's precisely because this is overall an amazing game that these moments stick out so painfully. The good times far outnumber the bad, that's for sure, but they're still there and I can't just ignore them. With that said, it's now time to stop talking about the base game and move on to the DLCs. When ACD2 released back in February 2025, I made the conscious decision to wait until they released all of their DLCs before starting my playthrough. As such, I was able to play and judge the DLCs not as individual, separate packages added long after I was done with the base game, but rather as fully integrated parts of the experience, in the same way new players are most likely to see them. I'll talk about them one by one for the purposes of this video, but I want you to know I did not mainline any of them. Instead, I played through them little by little alongside the main plot, and personally, that's how I recommend doing it. First of all, there's the 3 pre-order bonus DLCs, Shields of the Seasons Passing, Gallant Huntsman's It, and The Lion's Rest. The first 2 add some rather nice looking equipment to Henry's storage chest, which you can access almost immediately after the tutorial. They're stylish and aren't overpowered compared to their base game equivalents, but getting them so early causes you to skip that initial process of having to struggle back from losing everything. Personally, I only touched them after I had already acquired similar equipment elsewhere. The Lion's Rest is a bit different in the sense that it actually makes you work for the reward. It's a treasure hunt kind of side quest that sends you to find a set of powerful equipment hidden all over the map. If you don't just look it up on the internet, it makes for a pretty hard puzzle that tests your reading comprehension skills as well as your knowledge of the area. Then there's the rewards you get for electing your game to the Deep Silver servers. Once again, they're all pretty much just re-skins of base game items delivered straight to Henry's storage, which means you can skip just about 90% of the gear progression if you want. Again, I only started using them after I'd already found their base game counterparts. There's something to be said about in-game content, especially quests, being withheld from players so it can be used as pre-order bonuses instead, but since the Royal Edition includes all DLC, even these, for a significant discount, I'll consider that a non-issue. That's one of the perks of waiting a little before buying new releases, I guess. Let's move on to the 3 big DLCs in release order. Brushes with Death was the first major DLC to be released and, in terms of story, is my favorite of the 3. It features a very open-ended storyline where Henry meets Master Voita, a turbot painter, uncovers his past and changes his future for better or worse. Master Voita's aura of mystery and the almost supernatural horror atmosphere that tinges his missions feel like a great departure from the main game's storytelling. This DLC also does a stellar job of respecting decisions made by the player, both in dialogue and in action. Voita felt like a tortured man trapped inside his own head, and the way the game allows you as Henry to choose how you deal with him without trying to railroad you into a single predefined ending really made an impression on me. In terms of gameplay, the only addition is the ability to decorate your shields with a bunch of highly customizable patterns and symbols. The interface for painting is pretty solid, and the developers went back into the main game and changed most missions, including side quests, to unlock new symbols for you to use, so the mechanic truly feels as an integral part of the game, but it does suffer from one major flaw. Kingdom Come is a first-person game. You never, ever get to see the front of your shield, except maybe in a few cutscenes. So I had this really old cheating painted on mine, which I kept as part of my secondary weapon set for most of the game, and I cannot tell you of a single time I saw it, other than when I was literally choosing the design in the first place. So yeah, it is a great feature, but unfortunately it just doesn't fit the game. Now we move on to the next DLC, Legacy of the Forge. If Brushes with Death is my favorite story DLC, Legacy of the Forge is my favorite in terms of gameplay. It takes a while to reach, but once you do, you get a new, upgradable base of operations and one of the best quality of life features in the whole game. In Legacy of the Forge, Henry discovers the smithy where his father worked as an apprentice closed down after the old master died and his apprentices all left. The questline has Henry joining the Blacksmith Guild, taking over the smithy and restoring it to its former glory, while also dealing with some unfinished business left behind by his father. It has a very upbeat story with interesting characters, but above all, it adds a much-needed gold thing, or silver thing I guess, to the game, as you slowly improve Henry's smithy and turn it into a luxurious home base, complete with a comfortable bed, all of the crafting stations you need, your own apprentices, and more importantly, a sales chest where you can put all your spare items for Madalena, the old master's widow, to sell in your place. Holy hell, it's so convenient! You see, a common issue with this kind of RPG is selling enemy loot as, more often than not, no single shopkeeper can afford all the items you're trying to sell, forcing you to play the part of a door-to-door salesman trying to offload your trash to whoever will accept it. And the problem only gets worse over time as your carrying capacity increases and enemies start dropping more valuable equipment. Not here. As soon as you reopen the smithy, you can deposit pretty much anything in the chest and leave old Madalena to do the rest. It's not instant and it feels like she doesn't get as much money as you would by selling yourself, but it must have cut down my time spent shopping by at least 90% and I am very thankful for it. The side activities remind me a lot of Skyrim's Radiant system, where you talk to someone, get assigned a randomly generated quest, and receive a suitable reward when you finish it. But much like the other Skyrim-like aspects of this game, ACD2 significantly improves upon it. First of all, there's a bunch of different activities you can embark on: smithing, dueling, dice throwing, bandit hunting, thievery, philanthropy, and archery contests. Second, each of these activities has a bunch of unique dialogue associated with it, and some even work as literal quest chains, like developing a friendly rivalry with a knight or helping out the owner of the local shooting range. Other than monetary rewards, they also increase your shop's prestige, unlocking new upgrades for the smithy. Moreover, they act as nice bite-sized activities to do when you have some free time, but not enough to commit to a full mission. Some people have complained that maxing out your prestige feels grindy, but I believe that criticism comes mainly from players who finished the main story before Legacy of the Forge's release and then came back to mainline it, which shouldn't be a problem for anyone watching this review. Just remember to do a couple of activities now and then, and you get there eventually. Lastly, we have Mysteria Ecclesiae, the last DLC of the game, released in early November last year. In Mysteria Ecclesiae, Henry accompanies Master Albie, a royal physician, on a visit to a nearby monastery. Once they arrive, they discover some of the monks have fallen victim to a mysterious disease, and Albie, virtuous man that he is, agrees to stay and help treat them. Fearing a plague, the abbot decides to isolate the monastery and institute a severe lockdown, despite Albie's protest. Albie then asks Henry to violate the lockdown and investigate the true nature of the disease to improve their chances of curing it. This means your enjoyment of this DLC will hinge largely on how much you enjoy ACD2's stealth system. There are guards patrolling everywhere, and you have to slowly sneak your way around the monastery, gathering information, helping wayward monks, and generally finding ways to get inside places you're not allowed to enter. Now, if Brushes with Death is my favorite story DLC, and Legacy of the Forge is my favorite gameplay DLC, where does that leave Mysteria Ecclesiae? Nowhere near either of them, unfortunately. The stealth system in ACD2 works fine, but the monastery is huge, so sneaking around turns this DLC into an absolute slog. Worse yet, since the monastery is closed off, you're forced to keep going through the DLC missions all the way to the end, whether you want to or not, so prepare yourself for hours upon hours of walking slowly in the dark, unless you don't mind killing a bunch of innocent guards just for doing their job, I guess. Of course, a good story can make up for poor gameplay, but this was most definitely not the case here. The story is a slow, predictable affair, to the point I could tell exactly how it was going to end as soon as the abbot declared lockdown, and I won't spoil it here, but my only surprise in the whole DLC was finding out just how hard the ACD2 writers would drop the ball, even though they've time and again proven themselves capable of doing much, much better. The only saving grace for Mysteria Ecclesiae is the monastery itself. It's marvelous, absolutely beautiful, especially inside the cathedral. Early on, when you've just arrived, you can ask one of the monks for a tour, and I suggest you take it, both for the purpose of becoming familiar with the area layout so you have an easier time sneaking around it later, but also because it allows you to take in the sights and learn a little about the place's history and the life of a medieval monk. Before ending the video, there's only one quick topic I'd like to discuss with new players in particular. Whether you should skip the first game and go straight to playing ACD2, or go back and start from the beginning. The developers spent a lot of effort making ACD2 an acceptable starting point for new players by setting the story in a completely different area, featuring mostly new characters, and quickly going through the main events of the first game during the prologue. So, if you want to, there's nothing stopping you from enjoying ACD2 even if you don't know anything about the first game. But, here's the thing. The original ACD is a great game in its own right, and anyone who enjoyed the second game is likely to enjoy going back to the first, but then you run into two issues. First, There's no denying ACD2's gameplay is an evolution of the original, and going back to an inferior version will be an uncomfortable experience. Trust me, I've done it while writing this script and did not enjoy having to reacclimate myself with the first game's flaws. You can't miss what you've never known, so starting with the first game allows you to enjoy the gameplay more than going back for it later. Second, as you would expect, ACD2 spoils pretty much all the big story moments of the first game. Hell, even this review spoils some parts of ACD1 purely because there's just no other way to describe ACD2 without at least mentioning events and characters from the first game. So yeah, I suggest new players start with the original Kingdom Come Deliverance and then move on to the second. In fact, as of the time I'm recording, there's this bundle, the Saga bundle, featuring both games and all their DLCs at a 30% discount, so I'd go for that one. And this marks the end of this review. This is by far the longest script I've ever written, 17 pages in all, and for sure the longest review I've ever recorded. Feedback is always appreciated, and whether you stuck around from the start or skipped right to the end, I thank you for watching, and I hope this video helps you decide whether or not ACD2 is a game made for you. It definitely was for me.